Hey there, I'm James of Pistils and Pollen. Welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you're here because today we're talking all about one of my favorite plants, Peperomia. These Peperomia are just so gorgeous. Why do I love Peperomia? They're actually really look at, I'm gonna show you these leaves. They're just so succulent and juicy, and I don't know why Peperomia have such an appeal to folks, but this is definitely a collector plant. It's one of those plants where if you add one Peperomia to your collection, you're probably gonna add another one, and then another one, and another one. And I don't know, it took me a while to figure out the appeal, and I don't actually know that I can name that appeal, but I definitely been bitten by the Peperomia bug. And there's just something about these plants that I absolutely love. One of them is all the different colors and shapes the leaves come in. But let's get right into the care guide, how to care for these lovely, gorgeous Peperomia plants. So let's talk a little bit more about the natural history of these Peperomia plants, because there's a reason why there are so many different varieties and shapes and colors and textures to these Peperomia. There are over 1,500 varieties of these Peperomia plants because they're really adapted to tropical and subtropical regions of Central and South America. What do we know about these regions of the world, right? So these regions of the world range from the high Andes mountains all the way down to the tropical valleys. There's a huge span of temperatures and lighting conditions and weathers and climates between the Andes and the tropical and subtropical lower regions of Central and South America. And so these plants are found all across this large span of regions, which means they're adapted to a wide variety of conditions, which means then that is translated into the sort of leaves that these plants are adapted to, some of them being more succulent and juicy, better able to tolerate drought conditions, others better able or more preferential of the tropics where there's more moisture, higher heat, higher light conditions, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of different types of Peperomia out there and a lot of different conditions probably inside your home where you can squeeze one of these Peperomia plants into and they'll be very happy. So let's hop into the care guide for these plants. Lighting needs. When it comes to lighting needs for these plants, there's one word that I'm going to give you, and that's adaptable. These plants are super adaptable. Now, the ideal conditions for most Peperomia plants are gonna probably be a north or an east-facing window, right? Giving you sort of that bright indirect light that is not super harsh, but also bright enough to meet the needs that they have to photosynthesize and go about living their best plant lives, of course. But these plants really can, depending on the specific variety, tolerate those lower light conditions of a north-facing window or even a grow light, or those brighter light conditions. Think that morning sunlight that comes through an east-facing window. Watering your Peperomia. This is one of the trickier aspects of Peperomia care. Actually, my top tip for Peperomia, especially for the more succulent varieties of Peperomia, is to allow these plants to dry out a little bit more than maybe some of your other houseplants in between your weekly check-in watering sessions. So I like to water these plants, give them a really solid drench, and then let that soil dry out almost to the point where I think it's too dry, and then I give it another watering. Because I almost treat some of them, especially like I said, with these more succulent leaf types, a little bit more like a succulent than I do some of my other tropicals. So the rule of thumb for most of them is, stick your finger down in there, make sure that the top couple of inches are dry, but probably this plant's gonna tolerate drying out a little bit more completely like a succulent plant than some of your other tropicals. Soil mix. What's the ideal soil mix for your Peperomia plants? I'm going to recommend my aeroid soil mix, my custom blended aeroid soil mix recipe. It's the most versatile soil mix recipe for most tropical houseplants because it really does mimic that rainforest type soil that a lot of these plants, including most Peperomia, come from. However, that being said, if you are prone to overwatering your Peperomia plants, I wouldn't be opposed to going with a succulent or a cacti soil mix recipe, just making sure that the Peperomia doesn't dry out too long or too much for too often, right? So if you are a heavy-handed waterer, you know that about yourself as a plant parent, definitely consider a cactus and succulent soil mix recipe. However, if you think you are able to manage or mindfully neglect your peperomias from time to time, then I would go with my aeroid soil mix recipe. Let's talk about temperature and humidity. Now, when it comes to temperature and humidity, like the lighting requirements for these plants, I'm going to use this word again, adaptable. These plants are super adaptable with regard to both of these things. So because they are a tropical plant, the ideal range is that Goldilocks range between 65 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. That being said, some varieties are able to tolerate lower and higher temperatures depending on the specific variety of plant you have. When it comes to humidity, these are also very adaptable plants, right? Especially these succulent varieties like this one right here. I mean, they really just don't require as much humidity as most of your tropical houseplants. Even this is a lesser succulent variety, and they're still like, I could snap one of these and you could just hear this nice crisp snap like you're biting into a carrot or a crispy head of lettuce, right? Because they just are able to hold so much moisture in their leaves and in their stems. So if you have drier home conditions and you've tried to keep humidity-loving houseplants alive in your home and you find that you just can't do it, they're not happy, they don't thrive, they die on you constantly, a peperomia is a perfect houseplant for those drier home conditions. Fertilizing your peperomia. Now, when it comes to fertilizing your peperomia plants, a light touch is probably best. They typically don't need a whole lot of fertilizer. I would only fertilize these plants with a diluted amount of fertilizer when these plants are actively growing. And if your plant isn't actively growing, it's probably a sign that it's in rest mode and it just doesn't need all the extra chemicals and nutrients that you're going to be throwing on its roots, and it's going to allow salt to build up in the soil. So it's just not a good idea to water these plants. I do find them to be somewhat of a slower grower, and so the tendency I have found for a lot of plant parents when their plants are slower growers is that, oh, maybe I'll just give it some fertilizer, I'll feed it, and that'll help it grow faster, bigger, better, right? Well, that's actually not the case, and it's probably gonna work against you if you do that. So again, if they're not really growing, just take that as a sign that your plant is just chilling, it's relaxing, so it doesn't need the fertilizer. Once it does start to pick up in that growth, probably in the spring or the summer, then, give it a little bit of fertilizer, but not too much. Pet safety. Are Peperomia pet safe? Well, the good news here is yes. Peperomia are generally considered non-toxic for most cats and dogs. So if you do have pets that you're worried about, Peperomia may be a good plant for you. And that's it. So if you can manage most of these things, which is really not too bad. I mean, I actually think that Peperomia are some of the easier plants to care for, but let's just run through those top care tips real fast for caring for your Peperomia. Lighting requirements. When it comes to light, Peperomias generally like bright indirect light, but they're very adaptable and can generally adapt to brighter or lower light conditions depending on the variety. Water. When it comes to watering your Peperomia, allow the top few inches of the soil to dry out between waterings and generally err on the side of less water than too much water. Soil. Well-draining soil, my aeroid soil mix recipe is typically best, but if you find that you're a heavy-handed waterer, maybe consider checking out a cactus or succulent soil mix recipe for your Peperomia. Temperature. The ideal range for Peperomia, like most tropical houseplants, is 65 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, but they tend to be rather forgiving. Humidity. When it comes to humidity, these plants are also very adaptable. Most thick-leaved, succulent-style leafed Peperomias don't actually require very much humidity at all, so these are great plants for lower humidity conditions. Fertilizer. A diluted general-purpose fertilizer when your plant is actively growing is probably going to be okay, but again, these plants are pretty unfussy and they probably don't need a whole lot of fertilizer very often. Pet safety. Are these plants pet safe? Yes, generally they are considered non-toxic for dogs and cats. And that's it. Those are my top care tips in caring for Peperomia. These are great plants for drier homes. If you don't like fussy houseplants that you've tried to keep in the past that have died on you, they're a little bit more lush and tropical than a cacti or a succulent, but their needs are a little bit more compatible with that. So if you're looking for something that's lush and tropical-esque, but maybe not as needy as some of those other tropical plants, a Peperomia plant might just be for you. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.